Hey there. Can you hear
Hey,
me?
yes, I can. Uh,
Oh, awesome.
Wonderful. How are you, Joseph?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining me. You got a couple of minutes so we can talk about all things creativity and life stuff, maybe a little bit more. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so thankful for the ask and the opportunity. This is really cool.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate your time. So, do you mind if we start at the beginning real quick? I noticed that you had a lot of work in the, I guess, the creative space, not just in, say, poetry or getting things on a page, but in perhaps marketing or advertising. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I've actually spent the last oh, got like almost 8 to 10 years working in the television advertising space. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So how has that been for you in general? Do you think it's been a pretty tumultuous road? Has it been a fairly smooth going experience, or do you feel like there's a lot of lessons there?
I mean, I do feel like there's a lot of lessons there. I mean, eh, I don't know if I would definitely characterize it as tumultuous, but it is definitely there's a lot of volume, there's a great deal of frequency, and I mean there's a good amount of pressure. What I do specifically often requires sort of working between, because I work for like a fairly large publisher in the television space, and so the way we work with advertisers usually is like they will solicit us with this pretty, like, well, doesn't it's not always in depth, but sometimes they're rather in depth sort of brand briefs that will detail, who their target audience is, what their mission is, what their campaign is. Like you would behoove yourself to get a sense of like what their voice is and their creative that they air, and often they're looking to go beyond the traditional advertising space, which would just be commercials, and engage more closely with their potential consumer. And so that often involves aligning with some sort of intellectual property, integrating into a show, or even creating a piece of custom content that borrows that IP.
Hmm.
Because as we all know today, standard commercials don't really rate as much as they used to.
Mm.
And so in order for these brands and clients to engage with, you know, potential consumers, they really need to get into the meat of these shows somehow. Or, people
Hmm.
are looking for stories. They're not looking to be advertised to anymore. And so more and more, the creative you see coming from these brands feel like stories, like they feel like natural extensions of intellectual property. So for us, it's always a challenge to find a way to, integrate these brands or to tell these brand stories in ways that feel like authentic to the programming and that don't feel like overt advertisements. Because, I don't think people give people enough credit. People are smart. We can smell, nowadays especially, we can smell advertisements a mile away. And the minute we feel like we are being sold to or pitched to, we tune out. I mean, we
Right.
fast forward, we look at our phones, we it has to feel like a story. And so for me especially, I didn't even realize before I honestly got into the television advertising space, like how much I would really have to lean on, those skills as a writer. Because again, it's not just about like crafting, engaging copy or, coming up with a creative treatment. You need to do so in a way that feels not only authentic to a brand, but it
Hmm.
also has to fit again within the environment and the aesthetic of a particular program. So requires a lot of versatility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a tremendous sense of problem solving, and I'm really fascinated by that because I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you might approach this in a way that you are problem solving for something while you're inhabiting somebody else's body, essentially, or mind and body, right? Because the brand technically would be that other person. So has that kind of come easily to you to be able to inhabit those points of view, shall we say? or
Yes
is
and no.
okay?
Yes and no. Like I think it really truly depends. Like
Mm,
because there are always brands out there that, we have, a more, a more developed sense of familiarity with than others.
mm-hmm,
So, if you were to come to me with, for the lack of a better example, Taco Bell. Like I've seen enough of their creative over the last, decade plus to get a sense of who they are, to get a sense of like what their mission is, that the voice that they use, the ways they engage with people, versus like an insurance company or whatnot that I might not be so familiar with, and I might not know what their particularities are, and who specifically they're looking to engage, because it's not even so much like an awareness thing. Sometimes it is just awareness, and in those cases, like, it's a little bit easier because all you're trying to do is you are trying to quite literally make the public aware of the existence of this particular brand.
mm,
But you may have a very large brand, like, who knows, like a PepsiCo, for instance, who is, looking to do something not for Pepsi specifically, but like one of their smaller brands that has a very, a more niche audience, a more, niche goals.
yeah.
And all of a sudden, like, you have to understand what those are, and you have to work through the obstacles and the hurdles of, all right, how do I speak to this very specific subset of people
Mm,
and either, change their opinion about something or incentivize them to do something. Like, it can get very granular very quickly.
mm-hmm.
So it ranges. It truly ranges from, something rather simplistic to something very complicated.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine. Um, do you feel that this is something that you got into further in your career, or was this career path something that has been with you for a while, that you've been wanting to be a part of for a while?
Oh, I 100% fell into it.
Mm.
100% fell into it. I knew, like, I've always had an affinity for the television space. I always knew that I wanted to work in television. And to be completely honest with you, I was entirely unfamiliar of what integrated marketing even was before I started working in TV. Like,
And
my first role was, I'm sorry, go
oh
ahead.
no, I actually wanted to ask for clarification. What is integrated marketing for for
Yeah,
us in the
yeah, I will.
nosebleeds?
So I actually started, like, to get my foot in the door. I was my first interview within the television industry was for a marketing job, and at simultaneously at the same company was offered a job as a sales assistant. And I was so, hungry for work at the time and just to like break in, that I was
Mhm,
like, sure, why not? I'll be a sales assistant, thinking that, like, I'll do it for a while and then I'll like worm my way into something more creative.
mm,
And I actually learned, from my, couple years in sales, about the integrated marketing team. And integrated marketing, on its like, that people probably know integrated marketing as, or assume they know it as, product placement. You're watching American Idol and you see like the judges table and they're all drinking out of Coca-Cola cups. Like, that is a very sort of overly simplistic idea of what integrated marketing is.
mhm,
It's ways that brands can partner with shows to get their marks or their, insignia into the show in some way.
uh-huh,
But that again, like I said, it's a very simplistic take on it, because it goes well beyond that. It is ways of, you know brands can, I guess, depending on, again, the level of comfort that the production team and the show team has when working with brands. Like, you can get a brand like into the actual like plot line of a show. Like, all
mhm,
of a sudden, like,
right.
you could be watching your favorite scripted drama, and some random B plot has something to do with Pizza Hut, and you never even realized that was a marketing play, but it was a backdoor agreement that the show had made with the production team
Mhm,
to like find a way to work it in, but again, in a way that feels natural to the show, because again, it's not just about shoehorning some logo in the background. It's literally about finding a way to integrate a brand within the landscape, or the whatever what the webbing of the show, that feels like it belongs there. And that is, again, it takes so many different shapes and forms. It could be within the actual body of the show, or it could be like a partnership. It could be some sort of piece of content that we script out and create for the brand that borrows talent from a particular show, or that we make in partnership with the show team, so that it feels like an extension of the show. And maybe it's something that you see airing in commercial time right as the show, like right as you exit the show and right before you start seeing commercials, like you'll see a specially made piece starring whoever, Chrissy
Yeah,
Metz from This Is Us or something
right.
like that. Yeah,
And and
that's one example.
And you know the first thing that I think about, and I apologize if this is too overly simplistic, but there's always the story of Mac and Me, that old movie from
Hmm.
the '80s, and how it was essentially a a ploy for on behalf of McDonald's to create a narrative around their products. I
Hmm.
remember being completely in love with that movie, and just realizing that just recently, looking at some stuff on the internet where they said, yeah, this movie. The only reason it exists is because McDonald's wanted to create something using an ET sort of vehicle for their products, and thus the movie was created. And that may be on the extreme end of something that might be too crass, or might not have the right kind of approach for it. But um, I just think that it's interesting that there can be so many extremes to this. But what you're saying
No,
just
totally.
yeah, it just seems more nuanced what you're doing, and it is all about threading that kind of narrative around something that at first glance maybe you might not organically think that it belongs there, but to give it enough weight, right, to allow it to exist in that world. I mean, that's or even crafting a new world for that product. I mean, that's just sounds like a tremendous challenge. I can't imagine what it's done for your creative writing and your other sort of creative pursuits. Do you think that it's made an impact?
I think so. I think so. If only because like it presents the opportunity to like continually flex that muscle.
Hmm.
Writing and especially creative writing and writing in general is a skill unlike any other. It's a muscle unlike any other. And the more you exercise it, the more nimble you become, and the more agile you become. And they might not directly correlate, the kind of writing that I do for in the corporate world versus the kind of writing that I do for myself. But it's still creatively challenging, and it still forces me every day to like rethink how I approach something, and it exposes me to new approaches, to new ways of thinking. And so absolutely, like there's I would say, if not overtly, then maybe covertly, in ways that I don't even realize, like one contributes to the other.
Right. I think just at least for me at first glance, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like it's the immediacy of knowing the structure and hooking people in, because I think that just from an outsider perspective, it seems like that kind of integrated marketing really makes its biggest impact when it's just hooking us in with such a little amount of time. I mean, with ads and things of that nature, commercials. I just think that, like, you guys are always aware of the structure of something, and for some of us who are more like pantsers and kind of go along and try to seek the inspiration or whatever, it just seems like that is such a great skill to have, is just that ability to look at beginning, middle, and end, look at the through line, look at the hooks within each scene. And I just think that's a tremendous asset that would be just such a beneficial part of your toolkit.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not about like, you know, again, I think a lot of people, when they think about marketing and advertisement, they conjure up these images of like, car salesmen, like people who are coming after you because they're trying to sell you on something. And yeah, you know
Mhm.
what, at the end of the day, sure, are we trying to convince you that, perhaps, or I should say, is one brand trying to convince you that, they're better than their competitors and that you should focus on them? Sure. But at the end of the day, like when I pour through these brand briefs, what have you, when people talk about who they're trying to engage, like they use that word engage. They don't
Mm.
use, sell. That they're not trying to dupe anybody. They're not trying to like, they're not trying to in some way, like, undermine your own thinking. Like they
Mhm.
are quite literally looking to
Yeah.
communicate with a set of individuals. And it really does become a challenge, because when you think about when you think about writing characters, for instance, you have to put yourself in the mindset of a particular person, and you have to think about how they might react to certain stimuli or certain words or what have you. And it's very much the same thing when you're working in, in integrated marketing. You have to think about, all right, what is this particular demographic of people looking for? What do they respond to? How do you feel like they would respond to this particular campaign? Like, how can I talk to these people, not at them? And
Right.
so yeah, it's very much like, writing from the perspective of two different characters.
Beautiful. Now, you mentioned something that really struck me as I was browsing on your website. Beautiful website, by the way. You had
Thanks.
this little bit about the Costco box, and that's just such a fascinating thing. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What you meant by the Costco box in your bio, for those who haven't been to the website yet.
Sure. I really, like, when I try to describe who I am, like at the end of the day, like that's the metaphor that I continually come back to. It's such a silly little story, but one of my memories from childhood is like going to, what was then Price Club with my mom or my dad or whatever, and like you walking through this giant warehouse full of like all sorts of odds and ends and bits and baubles that are supposed to like attract you and make you want to buy something. And the most exciting part of that whole journey for me was grabbing one of those, empty boxes out of the barrel on your way out that you would then use to like store your, oversized cans of tuna fish and take it home. And like I loved taking like that empty structure when was inevitably emptied and like turning it into something,
Mm,
whatever the heck it was. Like I would grab my markers or, a pair of scissors and, make a Formula One car out of it or make a spaceship out of it, whatever. Like it was the most simple thing, but it was sort of, in a weird way, I almost liken it to like an empty canvas for
mm.
an artist or a painter, which I am most certainly not. My my physical art talent, I topped out at like, grade third grade. Like if I were to sit down and draw a person today, it would quite literally be a circle on a box. Like I still can't draw necks, I can't draw hands. I'm not a physical artist in any way, shape, or form. But to me, what that box represented, like it gave me the sort of starting point to turn it into something else and to like
Yeah.
get inside of it and like use my imagination to like sort of build a world. And that's kind of like how I liken myself as, as a writer. Like and why I think, I enjoy what I do as both a writer and in the marketing space, because, especially in the marketing space, again, like I am presented daily with this, set of basic tools, this
Mhm.
particular property, this particular brand, and I have to use what I have in front of me to great effect. I have to like turn that into something else. And that's, I guess, the metaphor again that I keep coming back to describe
And
myself.
I think it's a lovely thing because I find that as a child, when you're not tethered by any kind of idea or compass of any kind, you're still looking for novelty, for transformation within the ordinary, and I just think that's such a wonderful thing that you shared with us. So I really appreciated that. Um, being where and just to clarify here for my own purposes here, were
Mm.
you are you from the East Coast? Are you
Yes.
yeah?
Yeah. Born and
Okay.
raised on
Born
the
and
East
raised?
Coast.
Oh, okay. Um, I'm curious of what your experiences were growing up and discovering or refining your creative pursuits. Did you want to do something more theater based? I saw mention of a musical, writing a musical to convince your parents to go to Disney World. That was another thing that intrigued me. So, just for my own curiosity there.
Oh man. I mean, like I definitely I don't even know where to begin with that one, because it's like I, I my relationship with creativity and inevitably becoming a writer started as I think most kids do, as a reader. And I had an affinity for words. I had, pretty decent word retention to the point where particular stories that I had an affinity for, I would commit to memory.
Oh, wow.
And my parents would tell me all the time how I would ding them as a child if they were telling me, reading me a familiar story. And, were they to skip a word or a phrase, I would be like, no, 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 that's not how it goes. Like, I know you skipped something. And, for all I know, I like this is a totally common thing, but I know that I would never, apparently, I just never let it slide for them. And so, as things went on, obviously, you grow up, you start, you learn to read yourself, you fall into these particular, you find your genre, you find your, the sagas that appeal to you. And so for me it was like, going to the school and going to, the scholastic book fairs and,
Oh, yeah.
reading the hatchets of the world, which will inevitably lead to like, the Animorphs or something
Mhm.
that, these worlds that you fall into that you like want to become a part of.
Mhm.
And I think that, again, sort of naturally led to an inclination towards theater because I liked that ability to, play in other worlds that people created. So I did for a time, spend some time, acting like in high school and
Okay.
community theater and never really went past that. But for me, it was, I think I found out from a very young age that I was, I excelled at building off of worlds that people had already created
Mm.
versus being like a world builder myself. Um,
Interesting.
and so like I very much enjoyed that. And it's funny because when it came to writing again, like it very much mirrored that. Like writing at first wasn't something that I don't know if I really knew it or believed it to be something that I could seriously pursue. But all I knew is that like I enjoyed doing it, and
Mm.
I took in high school I took one of my courses in the high school senior year was a study of the contemporary novel, and I remember one of our assignments was to write a creative a creative piece that mirrored the style or the form of one of the writers that we had just read. And
Wow.
at that time, I chose to write a piece that was informed by Michael Cunningham's The Hours. And, for those who are not familiar with it, it's a story that is told from the point of view of three different protagonists who are all sort of interrelated, and each chapter shifts between the three, but they interconnect. And so I decided to write a story that instead of if I'm remembering correctly, it was like in the book itself, it's it's told from the point of view of Virginia Woolf, of somebody who is currently reading Mrs. Dalloway,
Mm.
and then somebody whose life sort of mirrors that of Mrs. Dalloway's. And I was and the woman who played the third person I just mentioned was played by Meryl Streep in the movie. And
All
so
right.
I decided to write a story from the point of view of Michael Cunningham writing The Hours, Meryl Streep like getting the role of that she played in the movie, and somebody who was reading The Hours. And it was quite literally the first time I ever had a teacher come back to me and say, "Hey, can I keep a copy of this?"
Oh, that's
So
lovely.
I thought to myself, all right, well, I guess I did a pretty good job.
Mm.
So yeah, I guess you could say that's like sort of how it began. But yeah, I mean, we originally started talking about theater, and I live very close to Manhattan. I grew up going into Manhattan all the time. My parents
Mm.
took me to at least like one show a year, and that
Okay.
certainly was contributive to my love of, again, inhabiting these worlds and
Yeah.
just being touched by somebody else's writing, somebody else's creativity.
Did your parents, it seemed like they supported you wholeheartedly through a lot of your creative pursuits. Was there any point of friction or conflict, with the arts, or was it a fairly benign interaction to make it a family thing, in terms of being enriched by the arts at home?
I don't think that there was friction. I mean, especially because, they were the ones who really sort of exposed me to that world. But again, like it started as recreation, like it started as a pastime. And then I do recall wanting to initially pursue theater when I was deciding where I was going to go to college and what I was going to study. And, you grow up with parents from a different generation people who went to school more for, its utility versus,
Right.
because they wanted to pursue something that they were like wholly passionate about. So when you bring up this idea to, your father, the accountant, and, both these two
Yeah.
people who live in the professional world that, oh, like I want to study acting. Like they don't, there's no friction, but there's a little concern. Like, I don't
Mhm.
don't know how like this is
Yeah.
going to actually turn up for him. Like, I don't know like how safe a choice this is. So we actually, funnily enough, we agreed on a mid ground, and that
Mm.
I would, I could go to school and I could study like something that was tangentially arts related. So I went to school instead for like television and video production instead of theater. But that was where the I guess the friction began and ended.
Mm. Okay. Okay, good to hear. Yeah, because I was gonna ask you, what led to making that choice to go to school for I guess, a middle ground, or something like film. What was your experience like, over at Rutgers? Was that right? Were you
Yes.
yeah. Did you have a very positive experience acquiring, some things, for your craft?
I did. I did very much so. What I very much liked about the program that Rutgers had was that it was incredibly immersive. Like it wasn't sort of myopic. Like we were very much encouraged to explore all facets of like the film creation
Mhm.
process. So we were tasked with screenwriting. We were tasked with learning how to work with programs like Final Cut. We were tasked with learning our way around, a set, learning how to light, learning how to shoot, learning how to edit. So,
Mhm.
we were, it was not theoretical. It was not a lot of book learning. It was very
Mhm.
practical. And what was great was that we worked with a range of professors who some of whom were documentarians, some of whom had more experience in like the short film scene. And so and it was a very diverse it was a very diverse roster of professors too. So not only were you getting different perspectives from artists of different disciplines, but you were also getting perspectives from artists who were from like entirely different cultural backgrounds.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, absolutely. I mean, I learned a great deal, I think, about who I was as an artist, and I think like I learned a bit more about what my strengths were versus
Mhm.
where my weaknesses were.
Yeah.
And so without a doubt, I left with a much more profound appreciation for truly what goes into the process of creating a piece of film.
Sure.
There
Sure.
are so many. I think, and I sort of love in a weird way what Marvel has done with planting these extra scenes within like the mid or the end credits, because like in a sneaky way they have sort of forced the audience to sit and acknowledge everybody who worked on this gargantuan film, whereas before they would just be like filing towards the exits.
Yeah, so there's practicality there, that is serving the story, right? It seems like a very useful thing to do, to get people to come back to the theater and stick around at least. What made you wanna go back for creative writing to continue studying the craft, at University of Texas?
I well for at least a few years prior to deciding to go for my master's, I had, an Italian mother who does what Italian mothers do best, and, nagged me for a while to think about, oh, think about your master's, think about going through a master's. Like,
Mhm.
it's really, it could be really useful to you.
Mm.
But I said like time and time again, I was like, I'm not saying no,
Mhm.
but I don't want to go for my master's until I know exactly what I want to pursue that master's in. I'm not going to go for a master's just for the sake of getting one. So I needed to know, like, because I needed to know that, like, I had like the belief and like the will and the passion enough to pursue it simultaneously with holding a full-time job, because I knew if I was going to
Mm.
go for a master's that like I wasn't going to be able to just quit work
Yeah.
and then throw myself into it like full time.
Mm.
So it was going to be something. It had to be something that I wanted enough to devote the nights and the weekends and all of the additional time it took to do it.
Mm.
And so it was sort of something that I backed into because I was working. I was working at the time. Finally, I'd worked my way into a marketing role in the television industry, and at that point, I had gotten enough, even as an employee at a relatively junior level at that time. I had been given enough opportunity to try my hand at writing ad copy, to try my
Mm,
hand at writing like creative treatments and whatnot, and I was provided with enough opportunity to get a good amount of informed feedback from some of the television executives, the programming executives that I worked with, who would say, again and again, like, I think you have a knack at this. Like, I think that this is something that you should potentially like look into.
mm,
And so, when people continue to, point you in one direction that you seem naturally inclined,
mm,
towards, your eyes open up a little bit and you think to yourself, okay, like maybe this is something that's worthwhile. Like maybe this I maybe I'm better at this than I think I am. Like, and I say that with all like all every ounce of humility that I can potentially muster there. Um, but again, like, when you get the encouragement of people who are, you know, several steps ahead of you, in their own careers, and they take the time to stop and encourage you, that has weight. It has weight, and
right.
it's certainly a positive influence, and it's encouraging. And I think once that happens enough, once people beat you over the head enough with like the same message, and it's coming from like several different sources and several different perspectives, you're like, you can't ignore it anymore. And so after enough time, I think I said to myself, like, I think I want to do this. I think that this is something that I want to pursue. And it wasn't because I saw a master's as, the key to unlocking some specific door. It wasn't because, there were any sort of gates that were closed to me without one. I really, at the end of the day, decided to pursue my master's because I wanted to, I wanted to see, like, it was a bit of a test to see if I was like truly any good at it. And B, like, I wanted to be challenged. Like, if I was
Mm,
going to pursue writing seriously, I wanted to put myself in an environment where I was going to be consistently pushed out of my comfort zone, and I was
right.
going to be, working alongside other writers and, other, readers, potentially, who were going to provide me with criticism. And I needed to see if I could withstand it and learn from it and just improve upon myself. So that's, where in 2016, I finally broke down, and I said, like, let's just do it.
So, in terms of mentorship, have you had a mentor, whether it's in your education, in the workplace, or in life, who has made an impact on these journeys? And do you have a specific moment that you felt transformed you?
I do. Actually, I don't know if she would consider herself my, official mentor, but I had a professor my first semester in grad school, um, in a class on the lyric essay. And I was entirely unfamiliar before I took that class as to what a lyric essay was. I remembered essays as something from high school, as, a sort of like a response to a prompt, or, as being more of like a homework assignment than something that I would voluntarily seek out and read,
Mm,
until I began to take this course and I began to read, these pieces by incredible authors who were sharing pieces of their life,
mhm,
but doing so in very like non-traditional, unconventional ways that felt incredibly creative, and at the same time, like, gave them the opportunity and the space to share something extremely personal. And the professor in that particular course was, an essay writer herself. She had been, she had a book of essays published, and it was the mix of, her championing the work that I was turning in, her, exposure of the entire class to all of these amazing authors, and, widening our understanding of what, writing and creative nonfiction could even be,
Mm,
that it opened my eyes to an entire discipline of writing, an entirely new genre that I didn't even know was possible. Like I entered transparently, I entered that program believing wholeheartedly that I was a fiction writer. Like my
mm,
writing sample for my master's program was a work of fiction. And when I exited that course, which, at the end of, I had to write my own, 17 to 20 some odd page lyric essay about, something rooted in my own life, something rooted in nonfiction. When I left that course, I was forever changed. And I
mm.
thought, I began to wonder, like, am I secretly a nonfiction writer? Like, and I learned, that's exactly what I learned over the course of the program. And I took several other courses with this particular professor, some in poetry, some again in creative nonfiction. And she was always, 100% accessible, 100% like available
Mm,
to, to provide feedback and to encourage people to really consider this as a legitimate path.
mhm.
That when it came time to write my thesis, like I knew at that point, at the end of that second and a half, third year, like this is the discipline for me. I
Right.
don't think I am a fiction writer. I think I'm a nonfiction writer.
So if I may ask, what was the subject of that essay that you wrote for class that you said was 17 to 20 pages, if you recall?
Um, the subject was a terrible decision that I had made while traveling abroad to,
Mm.
um, let's just say, have a romantic encounter with a fellow tourist.
I see.
and so, and so, and who knew that I could turn that into 20 some odd pages? I certainly
Oh, that's beautiful. That's incredible. Now, speaking of essays, can you tell me a bit about how your collection of essays, which is called "I'm Never Fine," is coming out
Mhm.
next year, right?
Correct.
Yeah. What was that process of making this collection coalesce into one project or one book?
Well, it began to write itself in grad school. Again, as I was working my way through the program, I began to realize that, a great deal of what I was writing, whether it was in my fiction courses or my poetry courses or my essay courses, all seemed to draw its inspiration from, a particular period of my life.
Mm,
And it, as the years went by, as the classes went by, as the assignments stacked up, it became again one of those sort of like unignorable things that there's something here. There's something that I apparently need to write my way through because I'm not done dealing with it, whatever it is.
mhm,
And if I'm ever going to get past it, apparently I have to write my way through it because I was drawing from a period of my life, where I had lost, before I entered grad school, it's about 3 years prior to entering grad school, I lost my father after,
oh,
a pretty harrowing battle with pancreatic cancer. And, it was, as one would assume, like a pretty rough period of my life. But
mhm,
and I tried to get past it in all the conventional ways, and relying, leaning on family, leaning on friends, seeking therapy. And it all seemed to help a little bit, but I it didn't really it didn't really have the effect that I thought it would have. And I
mhm,
felt, myself carrying that around 3 4 years later. And it
mhm,
wasn't until, I was sort of forced in that first nonfiction course to start writing about very personal things in my life, that I realized that once I started, reckoning with these things on paper and putting them down and creating this sort of like physical manifestation of what I was going through, that I could like empty onto the page and sort of like put out in the world.
mhm,
It was almost I liken it to, I truly liken it to like an ectomy. Like it quite literally felt like I was having something removed, that
mm,
I was reaching inside of myself, pulling out something malignant, whatever it was physically, and finally like feeling some separation from it, some relief. And it was because the writing had facilitated that feeling where nothing else really had, that I thought to myself, like, okay, like there is quite literally something here, and whatever it is, it needs to be dealt with on the page.
mm. Well, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear about your father. That's heartbreaking, and I appreciate you sharing that with me. But I feel that that's just a perfect example of the power of the written word, where you can have these sort of emotional exorcisms, right? Where you're just able to remove those really painful and traumatic memories or points of your life. And do you think that we as a society should lean more into teaching teaching our people, teaching our kids, those who are in grief or going through suffering, to use the written word as a way to heal?
I absolutely think so. I absolutely think so. And this isn't to say that, like, we should expect everybody who goes through something to, to make a book out of it. But even if you choose not to share what's going on in your life with the world, there is there is a release that comes from just like communing with that blank page, and forgive my language, just sort of emptying all your shit out onto it.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
page, the
for
page
sure.
is indiscriminate. It will take whatever you have. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out that, you know, you might want to keep to yourself. Like I'll like full transparency. Like anytime I write something that's halfway decent, it's because I have also written five or six other things that are total crap that I would never show to the world. But like I had to get that crap out because like we all write bad stuff. Like it's just gonna happen. Like nobody's perfect. But the page doesn't care. The page will take whatever you have. And you know, there is truly something freeing that comes with, and again, I'm not advocating that everybody do this, but for me, like it wasn't just about putting something on paper. It was that sort of mix of excitement and terror
Mm,
that comes with putting it out in the world and like sharing it with literary magazines or people, potential publishers who are willing to give it up, a public forum and expose it to readers and a whole world of strangers who are now going to get a window into an incredibly vulnerable and potentially dark part of your life that you may feel entirely embarrassed to share with the people closest to you, and yet are totally okay with like complete strangers just reading these things and developing impressions about you as a person or about your experience. But to get back to your like original question, when it comes to encouraging people to process through writing, something that I can definitely say, like without even a hint of hesitation, is that part of my experience in revisiting this chapter of my life when I was writing my collection was revisiting it from a place of distance. I
mm,
had I began my grad school experience 3 years after losing my father. When I graduated, at that point I was at like the 6 year mark. So I was systematically going through, I was rifling through images and experiences that I was, over half a decade separated from.
mm,
And because of that distance, I was able to see things and catch things that I hadn't seen in the moment because I was so immersed in what was going on. And
right.
my focus was so narrow that I couldn't see all of these things that were happening around me. I couldn't see and fully understand a lot of signs that I was getting from either people or from the universe or what have you. And it was in that revisiting of those experiences and finally having a wide enough perspective to let all of this other stuff in, that it fundamentally changed the way, like the it fundamentally changed that chapter of my life, and I no longer see it the way I saw it back when I was in it, because I was just too I was just too focused, and I was just too blinded by
Mm,
what was right in front of me to
yeah.
see everything that was happening around me. So absolutely, I advocate people writing, even if it's just privately, even if it's just therapeutically, because I guarantee anybody who takes the time to like go back and revisit something through writing is going to learn something about that they had no idea even existed.
Mm. Wonderful. And I know that you're going to be helping a lot of people, especially with your collection of essays. Any reader will be able to see your experience and what you've gone through and hopefully empathize and maybe see a little bit of themselves or their history in it. So it's going to be really exciting. So I'm looking forward to your collection. And I got a couple more questions, to be respectful of your time.
Sure. Yeah, no
But
problem.
in terms of poetry and deciding a medium for what you want to say, because as somebody who dabbles and is experienced in a variety of different forms, how do you decide what's a poem, what's an essay, what becomes a project that might require more people to come in to help you bring it to life? How do you follow that, or what's that process like for you?
To be completely honest with you, a lot of times the form dictates itself.
Mm,
Um, I will say that I feel that at the outset, it's a little bit of gut. But for me, like when it comes to differentiating, for instance, between like what I'm going to put in essay form and what I'm going to put in uh, poetic form, for me, it's often dictated by what it is I'm dealing with. If I'm dealing with something that, for instance, takes place over a protracted period of time
mm,
and that I know is going to need more real estate, automatically I start thinking to myself, like, okay, there's an essay here. If I'm dealing with something that's smaller, but still just as profound, whether that's an image or, a memory, whatever it is, if it's something that is small in scope but sort of like still deeply profound, especially if it's like something that you don't quite understand why it's stuck with you, because there's really no overt reason for this to have affected you, this very small tiny thing, in such a profound way. That to me feels more poetic
mm,
because it's a little bit more abstract. You might not quite even fully understand why itself is so impactful to you. To me, I try to start exploring that via poetic language because it requires a sort of unconventional process of breaking it down and sort of building it back up. And again, like at the end of a poem, you still might not fully understand the profundity of it all, but it's an exercise in trying to sort of break it down and figure out what it is. And maybe, as I said, maybe at the end you still don't quite know, but that poetry allows you to physically manifest that confusion in a
mm,
weird way. It allows you to take the pieces that you have, assemble them in a way that's like somewhat coherent, and allow the reader to
mm,
perhaps decipher what you mean, what you're trying to say. Like, and a great deal of time, it's often the readers that like point you in the right direction and illuminate something that you didn't even know. I mean,
mhm,
for me especially, almost anything that I've ever published has been seen by another set of eyes.
mhm,
I rely on on former fellow students from my master's program who are now friends. And I had, even throughout the crafting of my collection,
mhm,
time to time, if I was working on a draft, like I would ask a friend. I would ask somebody, like a third party observer. I'm like, can you read this and let me know, like,
mhm,
if I'm onto something here or if I'm totally and completely off.
mhm.
And 9 times out of 10, that individual will they'll pick up on something that will illuminate the path,
Yeah,
like to the finish line, like, and will expose you to something that half the time they'll point out something that you're trying to say without even you knowing that you're trying to say that.
right.
So for me, like, it is absolutely a group process. The writing does happen alone, but no, I mean, no, I think successful book is ferried, across the river without the help of somebody else.
Right.
you need a co-captain, you need people to read and respond to your work because, we are biased.
Hmm.
Ultimately, writers are
Yeah.
biased. We as much as we seek perspective, we often, can be blind to ourselves. And so we need people to, to help point out where something might be failing, where at moments where we think, somewhat arrogantly that we're being, our truly most artistic, profound selves. And then you put that in front of a person, they're like, I have no idea what you're trying to say here. So like you have to absolutely open yourself up with any amount of modesty and humility to readers, especially when your writing is raw and when it's new, because it's in those moments that you can redirect and you can find the piece that wants wants to be made.
Absolutely. So, I have so many questions, especially in regards to poetry, but I know that we're almost running short on time. But hey,
Sure, sure.
maybe at another time. But what are some things that you're reading right now or experiencing, whether it's media or written stuff, that's really inspiring you and taking you on a journey to somewhere else?
So I've been reading a great deal of nonfiction lately. I've always been a bit of, well, not always actually. That's a complete and utter lie. After after graduate school, I became a creature of nonfiction. Mostly because like I just have like such a deep respect for what you know essay, creative nonfiction, biography can do to educate us. How we can learn from the life stories of people that we so like greatly admire, and maybe people that we don't even know from a hole in the wall.
Hmm.
And so as I work through the revisions to my manuscript and start working with my editors, I think actually next month, I've just been so drawn to fellow creative nonfiction writers, perhaps for some inspiration and perhaps even for some release, because there it's being able to jump into like the fantasy world of fiction is fantastic, but I there's something deeply personal, and if you'll forgive me, almost even slightly voyeuristic about an individual who is so willing to let you into
Mm.
their life, like without trying to color it with metaphor or fictionalization,
Hmm.
that I that feels to me, at least right now, more transportative than any fantasy world could possibly be. So I just the last book I just finished actually was Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain.
Oh,
I wound up watching on a flight a couple of weeks ago. I wound up watching the film Roadrunner, which is a documentary all about him. And I,
oh wow.
as much as a sort of like culinary appreciator that I am, like I'd always sort of known who Anthony Bourdain was without actually knowing who he was. I didn't really truly watch a lot of his programming, but I was intrigued by the film. I watched it, on a cross country flight, and was so taken in by like this character that he
Mm.
was. Not just the fact that he was a chef, but that he was sort of like he was like he's a mixture of like Julia Child and like I don't know, like Keith Richards. I mean, like
Yeah, yeah.
he's this rock and roll star in the kitchen who like doesn't give a shit what you say. He doesn't like give into pretension. Like he was, I guess, very sort of like myself in a weird way, not at all to compare myself to him, but he was sort of an unlikely chef in that
Mm.
it wasn't something that he knew from day one. It was something that he wanted to do. It was something that he very much fell into out of necessity, out of the need to make a few bucks. The guy started working like washing dishes and then was exposed to this world behind the kitchen doors that just illuminated everything, and
Hmm.
it laid out the path for him in front of him. So
Right.
I it was a fantastic book. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I started reading it,
Hmm.
but absolutely became enamored with it. I've been reading a great deal of nonfiction about like inspiring creatives.
Mm.
Towards the end of last year, I read Brian J. Jones's biography of Jim Henson, who I've been a Muppets fanatic ever since I was a kid, and so being able to learn again, here we go, like another story about another man who started out wanting to be like a serious filmmaker and began working with puppets on television just as a means of like getting into the industry, never fully expecting that his life would revolve around puppets. Like just he would, uh, regardless of
Wow.
all of his other wants and pursuits. I mean, that's what we know Jim Henson as, like as the Muppet guy. And so now, because of just how fantastic that book was and how much I admire Brian J. Jones's writing and his attention to detail, I'm right now about close to halfway through his biography on George Lucas. So
Mm.
again, another fantastic book. But essay wise, I will always make room in my life for David Sedaris. I think he's quite possibly one of the best essayists ever, not just contemporary. I think just potentially ever. Like I've never ever encountered another writer who can make me quite literally like split my sides laughing just through the written word like David Sedaris can.
Mm.
And I just I if there's ever a fountain of youth discovered, like I want him to be at the front of the line because I don't know if I could ever quite envision a world without his humor in it.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. So one last question, and I know
Mm.
that we talked about this just a little bit in one of your previous answers there, but I'm curious of what your thoughts are on why we need the arts now more than ever. What do we get from the arts that we can't get from anything else?
I mean, the arts in really this is
It's
difficult
a
to say
big
because I know
question.
it sounds like
Sorry. Yeah.
I know it's a big question, but no, like my answer, I don't want my answer to sound like a generalization. But when I think about like every medium of the arts, whether that's, you know, painting, whether that's, theater, whether that's writing, it at the end of the day, it all boils down to the same thing. It's all reflective of the human experience. It reflects our world back out at itself. And it exposes us to uncomfortable truths. It exposes us to things that, we perhaps seek to avoid, and then all of a sudden confronts us with it, and we're forced to reckon with it. And, you know, we we need these reminders. Like we need to see ourselves, on canvas, on the page, on the stage, on film, because again, like it is an experience wherein we are held captive, even for just a brief moment, and are very, very much forced to look at ourselves in our most perfect and imperfect moments. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find an individual who, in some way, subvertly or covertly, hasn't been changed by a piece of art that they've witnessed or read or experienced. Even if they don't know it outright, it has influenced the way that they see the world. It has influenced the way that they commune with people. And if we don't hold that mirror up to ourselves, we are just going to be stumbling around blindly, entirely ignorant of, of things that are very crucial to know, that are fundamental to our, our emotional evolution, and, our ability to commune with others.
Mhm.
And again, that may sound like just a completely general and simplistic answer, but that is truly, at the end of the day, why I believe that we need the arts, because it speaks to us in a way that, again, just forces us to reckon with ourselves both broadly and on a very personal scale.
Mm. Beautiful note to end on. I appreciate it, Joseph. Thank you so much for your time. And as with any complex and super talented person, I could listen to you talk about craft and all of these little nuances of the pursuit all day. I mean, this I really appreciate your time. But I'm going to be putting all of your content links in the podcast description. But if there's anything that you'd like to highlight right now, just shoot me an email, let me know. But I thank you so much for your time and for all you do. And I hope that we can connect soon, especially when your novel or your collection of essays comes out. I'm really excited to take a look at that. And I wish you the best.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I always love the opportunity to have discussions like this. And, it it's if the beginning of the week is Sunday, then we've started the week off fantastic. So thank
That's
you
right.
for this opportunity. It was awesome.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Joseph, and I'll talk to you real soon.